Actually, one of the big challenges of bias in recruitment is because a lot of the training data is biased because it's generated by humans that are biased, right? So it's just like an interesting philosophical debate more broadly in AI. It's like, why do we want to hold AI to a higher standard than we hold humans? I think as it relates to recruitment, it is incredibly important that we take this seriously.
Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to and watching another episode of the Chief AI Officer Show. Today I'm speaking to Mark Chaffey, who is co-founder and CEO at hackajob. Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Ben, it is a pleasure to be here. Big fan and excited for today's conversation.
Yeah, me too. You are actually after a slew of chief AI officers at enterprises. I just recorded my first episode with a partner at a VC firm, and now you are my first startup founder on the show. So I'm excited to start branching out to dig into all things kind of AI go-to-market, tech go-to-market. And so welcome as first founder as we branch out. Big boots to fill, but, I'd love to start in terms of your inspiration for founding hackajob. You did that at 20 years old. What early experiences shaped your view of technology and how it could potentially transform hiring?
Well, firstly, I'm going to set a very low bar for every other founder CEO that comes on the pod. So, hopefully we can start nice and easy. But yeah, we co-founded hackajob when I was in my final year of university in London. And it was a really interesting kind of like evolution on how we got there. My co-founder, Raz, actually came up with the initial insight. He was working in a kind of traditional staffing agency, of which there are many in the UK. And kind of saw how traditional staffing agencies work. You have like a bunch of non-technical people trying to screen technical people, basically just spamming CVs out to companies and then charging like a fortune to do so, right? Like, charging 25% of somebody's salary in order for the privilege of that experience. And so Razvan, my co-founder, who I had met through university already, pinged me and said, like, I think we can build some cool tech to actually do a lot better job from like a skills-based matching and try and make the recruitment process a little bit more meritocratic. I think one of the really interesting things about technology is some of the best engineers that I've had the pleasure of working with and getting to know, like, don't tick the credentials that you might necessarily think, right? It's not something that you have to go to a great college to do. Actually, a lot of the best engineers were maybe just playing around with computers when they were 7, 8, 9 years old. And so is there an opportunity to spotlight talent in a completely different way? Make it a lot more focused on skills. And that was the genesis 10 years ago. It's amazing how true that kind of hypothesis has kind of stayed to the business. Obviously, we've evolved, grown, changed a ton over the last 10 years. And, with the latest wave of LLMs and, everyone getting very, very excited around AI, it's now really cool because you're thinking, okay, well, there's a whole world of new opportunities to really spotlight talent and how best to present somebody and how you tackle fake CVs, which is a big topic in our space at the moment. So yeah, that was the genesis for hackajob.
Oh, that's great. I mean, that resonates with me as someone who also has, I'm not a technical hire, but I have a non-traditional CV, and I'm also always perpetually amazed at how many British recruiters there are operating in the US market as well. So yeah, it's a big space. You touched on LLMs a little bit towards the end there. Do you see, and the kind of generated CV, but do you see AI today kind of transforming the work that you're doing at hackajob?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it is the most exciting period in my 10 years of co-founding this business. We were always doing bits and pieces with machine learning, and there was like some really interesting use cases, almost like how you build a better recommendation engine kind of pre-LLM. And so we already had that kind of DNA in the product. And I think one of the hardest things as a founder is to try and understand like what is genuinely like new technology that can solve new problems and what's just like the hype train. And, like 2020, 21 was all Web3 and crypto. And we were like, can you find a use case here? It doesn't feel like there's a natural use case here. So then when LLMs come along, you kind of have that same level of skepticism of like, okay, actually, is this really new underlying technology? Or do the VCs need something new to shout about and get excited about and create the next hype train? And so we ran an internal hackathon with our team and just was like, okay, guys, in a week, like here's some business problems. How would you think about approaching it? And this would have been May, June 23. It's probably 18 months or so will go now. And it has been incredible to see how much has changed in that time in the broader landscape inside our business. Like we realized, wow, you can now do things that weren't possible before, which led us to rebuild our matching engine from scratch, which was a brave decision and took us a little bit longer than we expected. But I think the most exciting thing is like the rate of development. And you just have to build with this mindset that everything is going to get faster and cheaper. Like our platform today, we probably had like the first working version of it with customers in Jan this year, but the latency was awful and it was just too expensive. Like we wouldn't have been able to productionize it. But by July this year, we launched it publicly and we've onboarded like 400 companies since. And actually the latency is incredible and it's cost effective for us to do so. And that was in like a 6-month window. The cost came down like 100x. So it's incredible to see that rate of change. And we are now constantly challenging every assumption that we have in this business, because I do think that, what is possible with LLMs is like a completely new paradigm. And so what was true previously may no longer be true anymore.
Yeah, I love that. I think faster and cheaper is the right way to look at it in some sense, because that resonates with all the conversations I had. There's a phrase that really stuck in my mind. I can't remember who said it, but it's the idea that this is the fastest depreciating asset in technology history. That there's like all of this value being created, but it's getting faster and cheaper at just an incredible rate. And I think there's a lot of talk of, we're hitting scaling laws. We don't know how much more intelligent LLMs are going to get, but they're certainly going to get faster and cheaper. So building with that mindset, I think you're spot on in terms of where you can accrue the most value. Obviously, there's a lot of buzz, as you mentioned, all the hype in the marketplace. When you're deciding to build internally, or when you're looking at vendors in the marketplace, or you're even just looking at talent in the marketplace, how do you separate all of, where's the signal from the noise? How do you deal with all the buzz?
It is tricky. If we think about those 3 different questions in different ways. So how do we decide what to build with? Like we've just got a big experimentation culture internally. And often we will build things for ourselves to use first. So actually we're trying like a completely different ranking system right now. And our head of AI partnered with somebody who runs hackajob on demand, and we just built it for Luke first. We're like, right, Luke, you're a guinea pig. Like, let's go and play around with this. Can this be better? Can it be worse? Now, actually, the big challenge was latency. And it was like, okay, well, how do you then think about that from a product perspective? Is there a different product design that you could have that kind of combats the latency, because the ranking is so much better? So we will always build internally first and test and see what that looks like. And we just encourage the team to just play around with stuff. Like, don't be afraid. And if it's not right today, it might be right in the future, and we get to learn in that process. So that's how we've approached kind of adopting a lot of the tools and just a lot of the development in the market. When we're purchasing AI products, I hate quoting Steve Jobs, because, obviously I'm nowhere near Steve Jobs, will never be near Steve Jobs, but he's got this great line, which is the end consumer doesn't care about the technology that you use to solve their problem. They just want their problem solved 10 times better than what it was before. And so whenever like somebody in our industry is asking me about our AI, or if we're purchasing vendors, it's almost like just remove AI. Like it really doesn't matter whether it is actually AI, what people are doing, whether it isn't. Like, what is the business problem that you're trying to solve? And can this piece of software, can this piece of technology solve it? And I think we saw it when the kind of LLM hype started last year. In our space, everybody built a tool that like helped you create a job description, or it was like a job ad. Or I went to HR Tech in Vegas last October, and these vendors that I've known for years are suddenly AI vendors, right? And it's like everybody is very quick at jumping on it, but actually, like, what is the business challenge that we're trying to solve? And our approach to that has been, how do we help companies discover talent that they previously would have missed in a faster, more efficient way? And the fact that we use a bunch of LLMs to do that is cool, but it's like kind of irrelevant, actually. It's like, actually, are we doing a better job of doing that kind of objective? And then the final stream of like, how do you understand the talent in the market? It's fascinating. We saw this when like cloud computing became really big, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, and every sysadmin rebranded themselves a DevOps engineer. And it was like really hard to understand, like, okay, are you truly a DevOps engineer, or are you a sysadmin? And the same thing is happening in the kind of data space right now. it comes back to this idea that actually you really want to assess for skills. And skills don't need to be technical skills. Like actually the most important skill to a technologist is your propensity to learn and your desire to solve problems. Like that is really the shared theme of all great technologists. And you look at our CTO, Vlad, he doesn't have a background in AI. He's not got a PhD, etc. But he is a beast. Like, he would go toe to toe with anyone because he's a builder. Actually, he gets his hands dirty with the tools. He goes and builds stuff. And him partner with Casper, who's our head of AI, and Chris, who's one of our senior data scientists. I love just being a fly on the wall in those conversations. Like, these people are so much smarter than me. I will just ask them a dumb, naive question, which makes that a really enjoyable kind of team to be a part of. So I think in this world of trying to identify talent, understanding the skills that you really want to assess for is even more important than what it was previously.
Yeah, I love that because I've seen that shift. It happens in every market, right? Not just in technical recruiting, but even in marketing, right? People go through phases of what is the in phrase for a particular role type, and then suddenly you see it everywhere. But at the end of the day, you need to hire for skills and like that mentality, which I think is hard to necessarily spot on a CV. I mean, you've built significant tech hiring platforms in both the UK and the US. Do you see any cultural differences there that are affecting how you're building kind of an AI first, or maybe not AI first, because as you said, you're just solving the business problem at the end of the day. But yeah, what are the differences you've seen?
Well, from an AI perspective, regulation is actually really interesting because New York were very, very quick with some AI regulation and the UK weren't so quick. And we released hackajob intelligence in the UK before we released it in the US because of regulation. So that's like fascinating that actually you do need to be aware of what's going on in the regs. And recruitment is one of the specific kind of categories that's called out in the EU AI Act, which is all around automated decision in the recruitment process and what that looks like. So for the first time, like regulatory dependencies is impacting how we think about product, which, in 10 years, we had GDPR in Europe, but you just kind of had to be compliant with that. That was like, kind of the rules of the road. Whereas this is evolving so quickly, and candidly, like New York have not done a good job. Like you have to get an audit, but anyone can audit anything. And you don't have to pass an audit, you just have to get an audit. It's like not particularly well done. They've kind of rushed it out. So regulation is really interesting. Outside of that, if you think about what we're building, right, a lot of what we're building is matching technology. Like how do you match talent to jobs? And that fundamentally doesn't differ, but the product element of it differs. And actually the best example is India. So the UK and the US are pretty similar when it comes to hiring cultures. The UK has slightly more employment rights, but they're generally pretty liquid job markets compared to somewhere like France and Germany, where it's much harder to fire people. So people are a lot more reserved in hiring people, so they're not as liquid. The US is probably the most liquid job market in the world of employment at will, and the UK is not too far behind. So there hasn't been a bunch of cultural differences there. When you go to India, which we launched about a year ago now, it's a completely different market. The biggest challenge for companies is only about 70% of the people that accept your offer actually start on the first day of work. People really only start interviewing once they've got their first job offer, and then they'll go and interview like 10 other places. Whereas in the UK or the US, you do all of your interviews, you get a job offer, you choose where you're going to go, and then you join that organization 95% of the time. So we've had to really think about how do you build like a post-hire experience in India, and how do we engage the candidate post-hire, pre-start date, whereas in the UK and the US, we just don't do that. We don't need to do that. So it's really interesting to see like becoming a global business, having regulatory demands that are different, cultural demands that are different, and how you end up with different flavors of the product in different years. Bluntly, 10 years ago, I never would have imagined that was the considerations we were making. But now it's like, a constant topic inside our product org of thinking about those different aspects.
Oh, that's fascinating. I really like that example. It's not something I would have ever thought of either ahead of time. I mean, you mentioned the regulatory aspect, right? I think when it comes to bias in AI, it's a problem for any use case, right? But I think there's a lot of attention paid to bias in recruiting, right? Like, how are you dealing with that at hackajob? I mean, when it comes to matching candidates or filtering out resumes, like, what is your approach to it?
Let me start with like a philosophical point on this, which is a bit of a bugbear, and then I'll talk to kind of how we do it. I think what's really interesting as humans interact with AI systems is we want to hold AI systems to a far higher bar than we hold ourselves as humans. There is no better example than self-driving cars, right? Statistically, self-driving cars are going to be far safer than humans very quickly. You could argue in very structured cities like San Francisco, they already are safer than humans. But it will be decades maybe before they're, the common kind of place, because one self-driving car gets in a crash, and it's like, God, we can't allow technology to do that. But we allow 40,000 Americans to die each year from car crashes, right? So, and the same applies in recruitment. It's like this idea that, okay, hiring managers and humans aren't inherently biased anyway. Actually, one of the big challenges of bias in recruitment is because a lot of the training data is biased because it's generated by humans that are biased, right? So it's just like an interesting philosophical debate more broadly in AI. It's like, why do we want to hold AI to a higher standard than we hold humans? I think as it relates to recruitment, it is incredibly important that we take this seriously. There's a very public case with Amazon back in 2018 where they had an automated hiring process, and the automated hiring process ended up favoring men over women because of historic hiring patterns. And so it's clear that, really bad things can happen. Our principles on this is we've not built any technology that will take decisions. So we are focusing on recommendations and ranking rather than filtering. Now, we will filter on like hard criteria. If you don't have the right salary for a job, there's no point showing you that job. But what we're not going to do is effectively hackajob intelligence ranks candidates, and it's a prediction between 0 and 1 of how relevant the candidate is. We're just ranking them right now. We're not saying, okay, well, if you're below 0.4, you're not going to show at all. And that's being really important in a core principle in technology that we will build for customers. The other thing that's really interesting and what we're able to do really well is when a candidate signs up to hackajob, they can self-disclose the E&I data. And about 85% of our users do. So we capture gender, ethnicity, sexuality, veteran status, neurodiversity for about 85% of our users. So then when we're doing all of our testing, let's say we want to release a new ranker, we want to release an update to the system, we can first historically test it and say, okay, well, if we were to rank candidates, using this new method historically, what would have happened? Is there any bias in that data? Does it favor one group over another? And that's been something that's been really powerful. And then the final thing is we trained a lot of this on our own data. And so we've got about 50 million first-party data points on candidates, jobs, employers. And so we've been able to fine-tune a few of our own LLMs based on that data, which is fascinating in of itself. But what's really interesting is a lot of our data comes back to this skill-based assessment. Actually, it's like, how good are you in a certain skill? And it's got nothing to do with your age or your gender or your ethnicity. So actually being able to lean onto that data set is very, very powerful for when we think about recommendations. I'm sure we're going to talk about what is the role of a human and AI as recruitment evolves. And the agentic AI systems are really interesting because we probably will get to a world where we want AI to take decisions, and then that becomes a much harder question around bias.
Yeah, or will you be in a world where suddenly you're matching agentic systems to people trying to hire them? That could be an evolution in how you're matching. And I love that you brought it back to that philosophical question, because I do think it's true. I actually agree with that. I think we should hold AI systems to higher account than we hold individuals, because ultimately, an individual is easier to be accountable. You can point to an individual as being accountable for a decision, and when you're pointing to an AI system, it gets a bit murky where that ultimate accountability lies, particularly with LLMs, which are kind of notoriously difficult to untangle in terms of how they're making decisions. You touched on it a little bit in terms of the skills matching as being something that is kind of core to finding the right people for the job. Are there any other unexpected insights that have been revealed as you're looking through all of the patterns in terms of hiring on your platform?
I was chatting to my CTO literally last night about this. This is not surprising. It's kind of somewhat disappointing. There is a very heavy correlation between the number of entities. Entity could be a skill, it could be an industry, whatever, that we store in our knowledge graph. And there's a heavy correlation between the number of entities a candidate has on their profile and the propensity to receive an interview request. And what does that tell you is that when people are screening profiles, they're just looking for keywords. And the more keywords you have, the more likely you are to be requested. Such a shame, because it's come on, we can build systems that are going to enable us to do better. Now, what is really interesting with our knowledge graph, and this is where I think LLMs have completely changed matching in recruitment, is historically, in that example, those entities are keywords that a candidate has on their resume and a keyword in a job description. if you think what's an LLM, well, all it is a computer can understand natural language. It can reason with natural language. And so rather than relying on keywords, hackajob intelligence will read a candidate's resume and then be able to reason why they're a good fit for the job. And it's not keyword based anymore. So one of the best examples is if you're looking for a senior machine learning engineer and they need to know SageMaker, a candidate could talk about knowing SageMaker, but never referencing AWS or never referencing cloud computing. But our system is able to reason, well, SageMaker is a service provided by AWS, so therefore the candidate does have cloud computing experience, and then explain back to the user, this is why they're a really good fit. And so that ability for the system to reason and like draw out conclusions from somebody's resume, like a human would, when we're reading a resume, we're adding a lot of context behind what somebody says. I'm adding context based on where they've worked. Oh, they worked at a 10-person startup, or they worked at a 100,000-person company, right? I'm making some level of context and adding some level of context to that. And that's where it gets really, really exciting, because I think you've now got a system. Now, our system can go and read 500,000 CVs, resumes, and then return the 50 that are most relevant and do that in under 5 seconds. Like a human just can't do that. And it's no longer just relying on keywords and keyword frequency. It's actually, trying to reason and understand. So I think that's where it gets really exciting. And that's what's possible today. Over the next couple of years, that's only going to get better and better. And that reasoning is going to get better and better.
I love that example again, because it's not just semantic search in the sense that you're going deeper, that you're looking at the meaning behind certain terms. They don't have to keyword match exactly, but a step deeper, which is understanding the context of where people worked and what that might infer about their particular skills. So that's a very, very good example where I think LLMs are incredible natural language processors. I think they have their limits also in terms of how they're actually reasoning and whether they're really formally reasoning or anything like that. But they're incredible systems for this, and you're just sitting on a gold mine of data to be using LLMs. So it's a fantastic use case for you. I mean, given your platform scale, and you've touched on some of the limitations there and some of the benefits, like, how are you keeping the human element in recruitment? Like, where is the balance for you?
Yeah, and it's going to be really interesting to see how this evolves. Today, we very much built hackajob intelligence in the co-pilot model, right? You need a human in the loop to use the system today. And the idea being is we can make that human 30, 40, 50% more effective and actually drive better hiring outcomes by getting the machine to do what the machine is really good at and getting the human to do what the human is really good at. So the example I just gave, right? No human can read 500,000 CVs or resumes and reason why 50 of them are the best in 5 seconds. Like, it's just impossible. That's a great problem for an LLM to solve. But actually calling the candidate and convincing them why they should come and work at your startup that nobody has ever heard of, actually, that's a very human-based job right now. And actually, us building that connection, and if you speak to people, often when they are deciding between companies that they're going to join, it's like, well, who did you meet in the interview process? And that's clearly a human-to-human interaction. So right now, we think that human needs to focus on how do you deliver the best candidate experience possible and really build that human connection and let technology take care of all the rest. And this is where, coming back to like the use of AI drives me insane. I was at a talent leaders dinner in New York earlier this year, and the most exciting use case for AI was like, oh, we can schedule interviews automatically. And I'm like, you don't need AI to do that, guys. It's a really simple problem for us to be able to solve. But like, let technology take care of all of the admin and let the humans kind of do the human stuff. And that's our view, and that's kind of our product vision for the time being. I do think the agentic AI model is really, really interesting, because actually, is there a world in which you do just have agentic AI systems talking to each other? And on the candidate side, this is already happening. People are using these tools that will customize your resume to a job description and go and apply for 200 jobs in one click. So that's not a human in the loop, and so do you end up in a world where we have agentic AI speaking to agentic AI for the first 5 stages, and eventually a human gets involved and takes a decision at the end. And that's something that I've really started to challenge my view on, is like the balance between a co-pilot system and an agentic system, and where you have, and it might not even be the right mental model, but it's something that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about is, how do we best leverage what the humans are good at and best leverage what the machine is good at.
It will be a fascinating ride over the next 5 years as we see these systems start to evolve, and just the level of accountability and transparency into how those agents are interacting, and because it can get into a mess very quickly. But on the flip side, the benefits of, kind of to your point, unlocking the most human elements of that process and giving us much more time to focus on what is most human and most important about that, just immense amount of time saved when the agents or even just the AI is dealing with all of that. You mentioned latency and like how you're building within hackajob for certain solutions. Like obviously there's regulations, there's the need to innovate in this space, which is, has 1,000 startups exploding and dying and being reborn every night. How do you find that balance at hackajob? Like what are some guiding principles you use?
Yeah, I think I talked a little bit about it at the start, right? We will always
Yeah.
build for ourselves first. So before we're rolling out anything at kind of production level, like it's always like, can we just build a scrappy MVP and test it? And often when we're building a scrappy MVP, we don't care about cost, we don't care about latency. We're just proving like, can this technology solve the problem? Because, one of our, that philosophy of like, everything is going to get faster and cheaper. So if we can prove the tech works today, but we can't do it at scale, it's like, fine, we'll put that on ice for a period of time and we'll come back to it in the future. That's not an issue for us. So I think that's really important. And we're just a very scrappy business. Like, I think I'm a deeply paranoid person. And you talked about there being 1,000 startups a day. It really feels like that right now. We're not going to lose because LinkedIn or Indeed beat us. We're going to lose because some scrappy startup comes out and does something really cool. And that definitely keeps me up at night. So I push our team to experiment a lot. We've got like this mental model of like, what are the big bets that we're taking, which is low probability that it's going to work, but if it does work, transforms our business. But we're at this scale where we also need to kind of continue to iterate on the core business, which isn't necessarily the sexiest thing in the world, right? We rolled out this new feature. It enables customers to post one job in multiple locations. Our system never able to do that. We can do that now. Like our customers love that feature, right? It's like very boring, very basic, like drove our team a bit mad from an architecture perspective, done. And so you have to balance like the iterative improvement of our core business with then like the big bets that we're willing to take. And one thing that we've done on the big bets is really constrain the time periods on which our team can work on them. So the longest we will commit resource to a bet is 4 weeks. And ideally it's 2 weeks. Really, it should just be one sprint. And like constraint is a great, thing in product development. So if you constrain the team to something that they can build in 2 weeks, it's like, okay, cool, go and test it. So we're literally in the current sprint, our CTO is working on an agentic interviewer. There's a bunch of these tools out there. We've got quite an interesting use case for it. And so Vlad's got 2 weeks to build an MVP for us to be able to test it with 500 users. Like that's the constraint that you have. And I think that's the final thing that I would say is I think every founder gets like FOMO, different founders at different stages. And I've got a bunch of friends that are very much in that 0 to 1 phase right now. And like, they don't have any tech debt, people there. It's just like, small scrappy startup, off you go. I think the really fun thing about the phase that we're in now is, we have 80,000 candidates interviewing with companies today. We've got 400 customers that are using the platform. So actually, when we do roll out something, we have some level of scale to be able to test it with. And my founder friends that were in the very early stage do remind me that, Mark, you have paying customers, and that's a really nice thing to have. So I think that didn't answer your question directly, but that's just kind of a little bit of the philosophy of how we think about running the company, and whether to take the big bets ideas, whether to iterate on the core products. And I think it comes from a place of deep paranoia that probably drives our team slightly insane.
No, I love that though. Paranoia driving the innovation, which you are constraining to make sure that you still protect the revenue lines that are core to your business. I think you're building a company the right way, Mark. It's nice to hear you talk about some of the specifics. Having built it, right? You were young when you founded hackajob 20. What's changed for you, right? You mentioned you hired you have these 3 AI people that you love being a fly on a wall in, but like, how are you building teams today versus when you started?
Yeah, I think the best example or the best framework for this is the Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't know if you're aware of the Dunning-Kruger effect or if your audience are, but it's this concept that when you have a little bit of knowledge, like just a small amount of knowledge, your confidence is really high. And then as you learn more, your confidence just slowly depreciates to a point at which it normalizes and then slowly starts rebuilding. And I just think that is the perfect analogy of the 10 years of me running this business. Was honestly, when I was 20, 21, I was like a cocky little Yeah, I thought could rule the world. And I will never forget, we went through Techstars and John Bradford was the MD. He's an awesome guy. And he just like really came at me one day and it was just like, Mark, you know nothing. And my cocky 20-year-old self wanted to prove him wrong, but he was definitely very right. And I think in that process of, realizing how little you know, it comes back to it's all about hiring. And I'm not saying that as somebody that runs a rec tech business, but I couldn't build the systems that we're building, right? That is the reality. But I think I've got the ability to hire and attract people that can, and then really create the right environment and empower them to take risks and to really try and push the needle. I often think that my job is the pace setter. Like I will be annoying in how quickly I want things done, in that paranoia that we were just talking about. But it is not my job to think about like the most technical solution that we could build. Actually, you've got people that are just far smarter than me. And if I can create the right environment for them, they're going to get to outcomes that I would never get to. And I just don't think I had that probably sophistication and almost maturity, I guess, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 5 years ago to be able to set up teams like that.
I like that a lot. It reminds me of an Oscar Wilde. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, the less you know, the more you believe, which I think is the flip side to what you just outlined. And yeah, it's important as your company scales, right, to know where your blind spots are and to bring in the right people. And hiring is so critical to that. Do you have any success stories, maybe more just on the AI side, about like how some of the things that you've shipped have radically kind of improved the hiring process for your clients? Like what are the you talked about that small product feature that was easy to, kind of painful to build, not so sexy, but ultimately helped your customers a lot in terms of distributing jobs across different places. But what else have you seen bring a lot of value to clients lately?
I think it's when you bring together unstructured requirements. So our old matching system, pre-hackajob intelligence, was brilliant when you had like a senior software engineer that needed to know Java, AWS, microservices. Very structured requirements, very easy to do. We just had a customer working on hackajob on demand, which is our contract hiring platform. And they needed a senior data engineer with FHIR experience. I mean, in 10 years, I had no idea what that was. And it turns out that it's a medical API protocol. It's the perfect use case for hackajob intelligence because hackajob intelligence will go and do what a human would do in that instance, which is, okay, well, then I need to look for people who've got the data engineering skills, but have done it in a medical environment that have worked on API projects. And what was really interesting was the customer was able to build a shortlist. I can't remember how many specifically, 5 to 10 people. Not one person referenced FHIR on their CV or their resume, but every single candidate had experience working with it. And it's just like you couldn't do that level of inference and that level of reasoning in an old system. Like you just would have to pick up the phone, speak to the candidate, check they know it, etc. And it's really made us think about, okay, coming back to what I said earlier, unfortunately, companies do just scan for keywords. And if a company had seen those resumes, they wouldn't have seen FHIR and would have just ignored that candidate. And so we are now thinking about how can we do deeper levels of qualification? How can we understand that upfront to understand the reason that you're kind of in? And that's what I love about, I think what often people miss is that it's not necessarily what AI can do or what tech can do. It's how do you build a product that your users know how to use and want to use that leverages that technology. And that to me is probably the best example of hackajob intelligence so far. And yeah, we'll definitely be sharing a case study on that because it's just cool. It's just like a really cool use case.
Yeah, and the value is so clear, right? It's the customer, which is amazing. That, as you said, something you just would not have been able to do that long ago. Looking forward a little bit, right? We've talked about regulation and other things, but are there any, and you've mentioned agentic, obviously, but are there any other types of technologies or just shifts in the space that you're particularly excited about over the next few years?
I was listening to an interview of Jensen with Brad Gerstner a couple of weeks ago on Brad Gerstner's podcast. And it really gave me the mental model to challenge our team on latency. So latency has been one of the biggest topics internally when we think about how we're building and what we're building. And Jensen in this interview said, well, imagine if you gave, I think they were talking about O1. And it's like, imagine if you gave a system a task and said, you've got a day to go and figure this out and come back to me after a day of like you reasoning and go and do it and give them the outcome. And it was a great mental model because I went to our team and I said, okay, when a hiring manager gives an internal recruiter a brief, how long do you think it is before they get a short list of candidates for them to interview? I would mean. It's like probably 14 days. Okay. We're discussing latency latency between like 1 second and 5 seconds. Like, actually, should we rip up that mental model altogether and say, no, you tell hackajob intelligence what you want and give it a day, and it will come back to you in a day, and it'll tell you, is your requirement realistic? Like, do these people exist in your location, salary banding, etc.? And if not, this is what you can change to make your requirement realistic. Okay, your requirement is realistic, great. Here are 5 people that I've already pinged, as in hackajob intelligence, and said, hey, this is a job that might be a fit for you. Are you interested? And they've confirmed they're interested. And here's their interview availability and when they can speak to the hiring manager. And so you took a process that was 14 days and you made it a day. And we were so busy talking about whether it was 1 second or 5 seconds. And so that was just like a completely different mental model to how to think about these systems. And we're not productionizing that yet. It's not something that's going to be, built in like the immediate future. But again, just gave me that mental model to think about, this is not just like latency and how we use software today. There could be completely new ways in how we interact with software by leveraging some of these, more agentic like systems. So that was like a really cool thing. And one consistent theme that I always tell the team is I'm not that smart. I just listen and read a lot. So when somebody like Jensen says that, I'm like, shit, that makes so much sense to me. And so, share that with the team.
Yeah, I love that. And within a product experience, it all just comes down to managing expectations and how you're framing that, right? So if you put that in front of someone and say, hey, I can find you 5 candidates now that are not going to be, that might not be a great fit, but if you give me a day, here's everything I'll do for you. Like 90% of people are going to pick that other thing, right? And it's just give them that experience. And then there's so much you can do with that. I love how specific that is. You've talked about human in the loop and agentic systems. Are there anything that you think will always remain with the humans in this process?
Yeah, I think that the interview process, I've always joked before LLMs until it's AI hiring AI, there needs to be a human in the loop somewhere. I used to joke saying, that might happen in 50 years, AI hiring AI. Might happen a lot sooner, actually. But I think, whilst it is companies hiring humans, I think the interview process, the back end of the interview process. And I think the thing that's really important is we operate in the tech ecosystem. The tech ecosystem is there is more jobs than there are candidates. People are in really high demand. And so the experience you give that individual is really, really important. And so the internal recruiter's role of giving somebody a really great experience is really important. And I think technology will make that experience better. That is different in an environment where you have a lot more candidates than you do jobs. Honestly, I think in that environment, humans won't be in the loop. We're working with one of the biggest retailers in the UK on kind of their AI strategy, and they're going to have a chatbot as their career site that if you qualify through that, you're then going to go to an AI interviewer, and you're going to go through the AI interviewer, which will then shortlist candidates, and then the head of the store manager will just choose who they hire. And I think in the kind of high volume world, I wouldn't be surprised if we go down that route. I'm not as knowledgeable in that space. I don't spend as much time thinking about it. But in our world where actually the candidate is in more demand, providing that really incredible human experience, I think is going to be critical and remain critical for the foreseeable.
Yeah, I think it's a good indication of how in the bubble I am, that when you said that, it made perfect sense to me, but I hadn't thought about it at all. That like, there's obviously going to be sectors of the economy where this is far more transformative. Are there any risks? Are there any downsides in terms of heavily integrating AI into these processes?
Yeah, I think bias is obviously the biggest risk by far. Yeah. And in that high volume world, do you end up in a place where, you've got just very biased systems prioritizing one things over the other. And to your point earlier, a lot of these systems are quite black box systems. We don't really understand how they take decisions. And so I think that's going to be the biggest risk in our space. My view on this has changed. I was really worried about the candidate experience if you're just interacting with these agentic systems or AI systems. I think the thing that could be really exciting is you can give the candidate a lot more flexibility. So if I want to do my interview at 9 p.m. at night, well, currently I can't do that because nobody's working at 9 p.m. at night. But actually, if I'm doing my interview with some type of AI agent, then I can do my interview at 9 p.m. at night. So I'm really interested in like how we use these tools to increase the candidate experience and make it better. But I think naturally the biggest risk is, it terrifies me. Automated decision-making in recruitment terrifies me because humans are biased and machines could just learn off that data and be incredibly biased. So that's going to be the biggest risk in our space.
That makes a lot of sense. I think there's risk for any kind of automated decision making, but here, yeah, there is a lot more that is going to touch a lot of lives. That gets us to our lightning round. I know we're almost at time, so appreciate you sticking with me. What's the most interesting or surprising thing you've learned about AI in recent years?
I mean, there's so many. Honestly, probably how quickly we didn't have cost and latency issues. I know we've talked about this already, but I can't get over like in Jan, our CTO saying like, we just can't productionize this. It's too slow and too expensive. And in July, we're rolling it out at like our biggest industry event. And I just don't think there's been a rate of change that quickly. I mean, the line you used earlier was beautiful and far more articulate than how I've described it. And I know it's the cliche and obvious one, but it is like really like palpable when you're like in 6 months, it changed that much, that drastically, that quickly. Wow. If you can think 2 years out, 5 years out, what is going to be the case? And I think that's the most surprising and the most exciting thing that we've probably discovered over the last 18 months.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful time to be a builder in this space, and what isn't possible today might be possible. And as you said, 6 months down the line, maybe even shorter this time around. What's one piece of advice you would give your younger self?
Generally, just broadly.
Yeah, I ended generally because I thought, we've been talking about AI. I meant in relation to AI and maybe what you've built at hackajob. Do both.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to do a PhD at Oxford in machine learning. I don't know. No, it's a really interesting question. I think if we could have done anything differently, okay, so what makes an AI system really valuable is the data. And how you turn that data into a product experience. What you described earlier of like how you turn it into a product experience is so spot on. And I think there were opportunities that we could have, knowing what I know now, we could have taken earlier to build a better data asset. I still think the data asset we've got is amazing. Something that we got completely lucky by, sorry to tell a bit of an anecdote, is when a candidate used to sign up to hackajob, we had a team of humans, we called them our talent curators, that took all of this unstructured data and turned it into very structured data, because CV passes, resume passes have historically been awful. And it was a really like frustrating, I always used to joke that if Elon Musk tweeted, everybody should go sign up to hackajob, like our system would break because we didn't have enough talent curators to be able to like get through all the profiles. We've now since automated that process using LLMs. But what that meant was we had hundreds of thousands of members with perfectly structured data. It couldn't be a better data set to train stuff on. It was like incredible. So that was one example where we got very, very lucky. I think we did an okay job of like technical validation of skills, but knowing what I know now and knowing how prevalent like fake resumes are going to be and AI generated resumes, etc., like we could have had an even better data set on kind of technical skills, and that would be really fun. So that's probably what comes to mind.
Yeah, that's great. There's a lot there to unpack. Last one. What's one phrase or idea that really stuck with you recently? You mentioned this mental model around latency already. Are there any others?
I think that's been the biggest one in how we're thinking about product development. Sequoia's latest blog posts was quite a deep dive really on, I think they described it as services as software and software as a service. And the recruitment industry is a $500 billion services industry. And so that's really interesting when we think about in the past, SaaS has been great. It's been about quality of earnings and you can get high multiples on revenue because it's recurring revenue and you don't want to touch services, etc. I'm actually getting dinner with one of the smartest guys in our industry tonight. And he did this brilliant post yesterday saying, actually probably the biggest, it's something like $2 billion a year on recruitment software spends, $15 billion a year on recruitment media spend, and $500 billion in terms of recruitment services. And so do you now have the ability to go after that? And actually the TAM of all of these businesses is so much bigger than what it was before. So spending a lot of time thinking about that and what does that mean? And that's why it's really interesting when you've raised money and you've already got a valuation that's built on one kind of principle, and you're left thinking like, well, is there an opportunity to attack something different? And we're very fortunate that we've got very supportive investors, but I think that services as software and how you tackle the bigger TAMs, I think is going to be really interesting over the next 5 years.
Yeah, that's a great call out. I highly recommend any of our listeners to go read that Sequoia piece because I've also read it and it resonated a lot with me. I think not only will it change the addressable market for a lot of software companies, I think it completely changes how you go to market, because I think the ways that you sell agentic AI is inherently much more of a top-down, like deeply integrated sale, versus more of like a product-led growth motion where you could get free users and kind of inch your way into a business. So it's going to cause a lot of disruptive change in the industry, kind of on all sides. Mark, I could do this all day, but that's all we have time for. If people want to follow your work and learn more about you and hackajob, where should they go?
Yeah, definitely LinkedIn. I'm most active on LinkedIn. I'm one of these people on Twitter. I still call it Twitter, but X, that I'm on it all the time, but I never post. So feel free to follow me on there, but I won't share anything insightful. But yeah, very involved and engaged on LinkedIn. So yeah, feel free to connect. I would love to continue the conversation with anybody listening.
Absolutely. So that's, Mark Chaffey, co-founder and CEO at Hackajob. Check him out on LinkedIn. Mark, thanks so much for chatting with me today.
This was awesome. Thank you so much, dude. Really appreciate it.